Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Weary, and I'm here today with Dr. Jeff Bilbro, editor at Front Porch Republic and associate professor of English at Grove City College. We're here to talk about his book, Words for Conviviality, Media, Technologies, and Practices of Hope. Dr. Bilbro, wonderful to have you today.
Well, thank you, PJ. I'm looking forward to talking.
So Dr. Bilbro, why this book?
Well, it's been a long time coming. I was fresh out of grad school and thinking about my next book project. And my first book was on 19th century and 20th century, I guess, American environmental writing. But I had sort of been making connections between ecology in the sort of natural science sense and media ecology, and thinking about some of the parallels there. And so this idea for kind of an examination of the media ecology in 19th century America and how it might inform the ways that we inhabit and navigate digital media today sort of spun out of that. And so, yeah, it's been 10 years that I've been mulling on this, working on this, writing this. So a lot has changed in the last 10 years, but I think one of the advantages of writing about a previous time is that doesn't change. And in many ways, I think it helps you kind of see through some of the faddish takes that come up when we're talking about social media or digital media today.
So tell me, what does conviviality mean? Because I'm sure a lot of our audience is wondering.
Yeah. Well, we talked about this a little bit ahead of time, but my title is kind of a nod to a book by Ivan Illich called Tools for Conviviality. And Illich's point in there's a couple, we can spend a lot of time on Illich if you want, but Illich makes a couple of points. Maybe one is that anytime tools become professionalized and institutions grow and mature, there are often two key watersheds. And so he just, in the beginning of Tools for Conviviality, he looks at medicine and he says in 1913, you had a better than 50-50 chance that a doctor who graduated from medical school would treat your disease in ways that were actually helpful. and medicine actually began, the professionalization of medicine actually began to improve treatment. And so that's great. And for decades, that was the case. And then he says, sometime in the late 50s, early 60s, things began to change with the rise of diseases that medicine causes or that medicine exacerbates in a professional sense and can't treat. So, he looks at things like chronic diseases, or, today we might talk about the opioid crisis, right? That things which were designed from this industry to heal people are actually making people more sick. Or just certain kinds of complicated chronic diseases that the medical industry is really bad at treating. And his point is that we're now spending more money, but the outcomes are actually not improving. And he thinks these watersheds happen across pretty much any industry. He looks at education. He looks at sort of different, like transportation. We now spend so much money per mile in very unequal ways. So he thinks in our quest to improve outcomes, at some point we begin degrading them. And what I'm trying to look at is how those watersheds perhaps influence or play out in the industrialization of print in the 19th century with the telegraph, with all the new printing technologies that made newspapers and books cheap for the first time. And, in many ways, I think it brought about improvements in communication, obviously. It increased the speed of communication. But I think you can draw a direct line between improvements in communication and the Civil War and many of the theological and religious and scientific controversies that riled 19th century America. And then, of course, jumping to the present, you see a similar cycle, I think, in the way that the early days of the web fostered certain kinds of communication and community. And then maybe with the introduction of the iPhone or something like this, there's a kind of tipping point that happens, right? So in the introduction to the book, I point out that in 2010, 2011, everybody thought social media was going to bring about democracy, bring about redeem the Arabs, the Arab Spring, redeem the Middle East from dictatorship. And now everybody thinks that social media is going to destroy democracy. So these cycles seem to keep happening, right? And what is that, and how might we arrange our tools in such a ways that actually promote living together rather than these cycles of optimism and then doom?
And as you're writing that book, and I think you get this from Ivan Illich, but correct me if I'm wrong, you're really focused on technology should make relationships better. That should be the purpose of it.
Exactly. Yeah, that's kind of his point with conviviality, that good tools improve the sort of or the freedom of individuals to foster healthy relationships and to live together. So rather than focusing on, I don't even know what the metrics would be for communication tools, speed or quantity, right? In that case, AI, ChatGPT is like awesome, right? We can crank out a lot of words really fast. But those are just the wrong metrics. And we should be trying to think about which tools will help us live well together and improve the health of our relationships,
So, and talk to me a little bit. You mentioned the telegraph, you mentioned newspapers and books becoming cheaper. Why the 19th century, and why literature? Do you really seem to focus on what's unique about going to people like Melville, Twain, Thoreau? Obviously, Thoreau and Emerson do have some philosophical bents, but for the most part, you're really leaning into literature. And why do you find that to be a unique contribution to this discussion?
Yeah, it's a good question. So first, I think the reason the 19th century appealed to me, besides that's just where my intellectual home is so there has been a lot of attention as people have thought about analogs to the digital media revolution today. Some people go back to Plato and the invention of writing. And a lot of people go back to the Gutenberg printing press. And I think those are both helpful inflection points. But I think an underexamined inflection point is the industrialization of print. And one of the things I try to lay out in the introduction is just how radical it was to live through the antebellum decades in the U.S. In many ways, the printing press that Ben Franklin uses is hardly different from the one that Gutenberg invented. It hasn't really changed much. There are very few presses, like in the dozens of presses in the colonies in the early days of the U.S. And then all of a sudden, they figure out how to make the whole thing out of iron, and then they can apply steam, and then they do the rotary press. And, you go from like setting the type by hand and pressing each one individually. It's very laborious still to, linotype and rotary presses, and you're printing out penny papers every day, thousands and thousands of copies. So it just really radically reshifts the way the information flows. And in many ways, the telegraph is the first digital technology, right? It's the one that makes communication across distance at the speed of electricity, and it reduces all information to ones and zeros, bits and bytes. So that's, I think, the 0 to 1 technology. And the internet is the sort of unfolding of those potentialities. So that's why the 19th century. And also, I just think we see the kind of political, religious, scientific disruptions that we're experiencing now. We see those play out then too. Why literature? That's a great question. So Marshall McLuhan has this famous adage, right? The medium is the message. But Neil Postman slightly tweaks that in Amusing Ourselves to Death. And he says, the medium is the metaphor. And I think that's really helpful. And he argues that whatever our communication technologies are, those provide the lens through which we view the world. They provide, they frame the world for us. They shape our expectations and our affordances. And he doesn't really talk about this, but so I'm getting this from Lakoff and Johnson, their book on
Metaphors we live by?
Exactly, that's it. Yes, metaphors live by. Where they say like the only way to think beyond a given metaphor is to propose a new metaphor. And that's what I think these literary authors are so good at. As they're struggling with the shifting communication landscape that they inhabit, they are throwing these different metaphors at it to try to imagine alternative, more convivial ways of communicating with and relating to one another. So, yeah, I think we want to jump to the kind of solution, like if we have this policy or this technology will fix things. But I think these literary authors are inviting us to the deeper and necessary first step, which is try to figure out like how do we name the world we inhabit and the world we want to inhabit.
And it may be, let me see if I'm on the same track with you.
Yeah.
If your goal is relational, that definitely seems to inhabit less a world of quantity over or quantitative over qualitative.
Yeah.
Is that also
exactly
kind of part of the answer there?
Yes, absolutely. But the metaphors are in keeping with the kind of relationality that you're looking, because metaphor really is a relationship, right? You're putting two things that seem dissimilar and saying, well, maybe there actually is a analogy that obtains.
I have mentioned this before, but I had Dr. Colin Webster on to talk about technology in the body in ancient Greek and Roman medicine. And he said you can actually trace, I think it's easier because our sources are so few and the rate of technological change was so slow. I think it's a good example. But the way that they talked about circulation in the body, they assumed that air and blood pass through the body in the single circulatory system.
Wow.
And that was because their pipes were not pressurized. So the water would go down. You just like if a kid built a pipe, you'd have the water go through and then it'd be air on top.
Yep.
And so they assumed that's the way it went through the body. And in Egypt, they created pressurized pipes for the first time. It's recorded in their history.
Yep.
And within 50 years, they had developed physician came up with the idea that there were actually two circulatory systems, one for air and one for blood. And it was literally just came from, it's this exact example, like they could not conceive of it without seeing it outside.
Yeah. And I think, we think science is so objective, but that we have developed beyond those limitations, but I don't think we have. We still imagine the human brain on a model with the most complicated technologies we have, right? We think about the brain as a computer, it's an information processor, when really there's all kinds of limitations to that metaphor. I've argued in my first book on environmental ethics that in many ways the sort of the Darwinian evolution and the way that it totalized scientific imagination for decades only happens because of the kind of free market competitive economy that Darwin experiences for the first time. Which is not to say that some kind of competition is not found in nature, but that is, as we're discovering with all kinds of symbiotic relationships and the way that plants interact, that is not like the totalizing explanation for how life interacts. But these models come up because they're the ones we have available to us. And it's really hard to think outside of the metaphors or the models that we have accessible. So that's a great example from ancient medicine.
And let me see if I'm tracking with you here. Like a perfect map is an isomorphic map, right? Like maps, but that would be too big to use. That's actually the worst kind of map.
It's because it's no simpler than reality.
Right. So Darwin's model's really good for a very specific purpose. Yeah. And it's like you have different types of maps for different purposes because the whole point of the model is to make it accessible to us.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So that we just have to recognize that these things are useful, but we should not allow them to become totalizing. And, as they become distorting or limiting, I think it's crucial to have the capacity, the option to try out different imaginative models.
Similar to the shift, because Newton's mechanics physics do work at a certain level,
Right.
but at another level,
They don't.
you have to switch to Einstein.
Yeah.
Einsteinian? Is that quantum physics?
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay.
And
Sorry,
so much. I mean, we don't have to get into physics, but so there are so many. I'm not. I can't speak articulately about this because I don't really understand it fully. But so many of the current physical debates are about which models work, and they don't know, right? Even models that seem to work are not compatible, and people are still looking for the gray one. I don't know if we'll ever find it, but again, I think it's like what's the metaphor, the model that best explains the very complicated reality that we have, and the best scientists are the ones that can keep an open mind and not get locked into any given model.
To shift a little bit, we talked about you mentioned the telegraph and kind of that 0 to 1 move from analog to digital. Can you talk a little bit about what it means that that's not neutral, but it's not necessarily, I don't know if you'd say it's amoral, right? Like there's this weird, talking about how the purpose of an instrument shapes it.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm still trying to figure out how best to articulate this. Some people, and so McLuhan here again is I think really helpful when he says that, I'm going to get it quite slightly wrong, but a basic paraphrase of his quote is, the belief in technological neutrality is the stance of the technological idiot. And the person who just assumes I can use any tool for my ends and the tools are neutral. And I think he's right. That's naive. On the other hand, it's not like that. I don't think we should imagine that our technological systems as determinative and as giving us no choice whatsoever. So what I'm really interested in is, and the way that I organize the book is first authors who think that these tools are going to be determinative in an optimistic, positive sense. So when the telegraph first comes out, people like Horace Greeley say, great, newspapers will never print falsehoods anymore because they will be found out instantly by the telegraph. Like no more false news, infallibly spread. I mean, this is hysterical, right? Now we experience the ways that improved communication only exacerbates misinformation or disinformation, whatever you want to call it. But there's a lot of optimism in the 19th century early on. People think, we're going to all come to the same agreement about reality. This comes in theology. Charles Hodge, the president of Princeton, has this theory that like the Bible is like nature, and if interpreters will just follow the scientific method, it will be perspicuous and we'll all agree. So some people think these tools.
I mean, that's basically what happened, right?
More or less.
Yeah.
The Civil War was a minor blip, right? It turns on, interpretive disagreements with the Bible. And then, so the second part of the book, though, is looking at people who were worried that these tools are determinatively negative. They will enslave, they will isolate, they will just make real community and healthy relationships impossible. And I think both have, like, there are affordances within these complex technological systems that can push both ways. So I think I disagree with either totalizing view, but I think they're worth attending to. And then the third part is I look at people who are trying to use tools kind of maybe against their affordances or against the grain in more hopeful and healthy ways. And I think that's kind of where I land, that we don't get the ideal system, if there is such a thing as an ideal system. But whichever one we inhabit, we're going to have to try to imagine together how to make do along its margins, and maybe kind of hammer swords into plowshares and find ways to use tools for conviviality rather than maximize the power, use them in the most powerful ways, which would, I think, eventuate in destroying relationships, right? As we try to use them to increase our own power, it tends to enslave others and isolate ourselves. So that's the basic model, I guess. But I think, back to your main point, I think it's crucial to recognize there is no neutral tool, but that doesn't mean like some are good and some are bad. It's always more complicated, right? They just have all these effects, often ones that are opaque to us as users of the tools, and are more apparent later on. So we'll find out, all the effects of social media in like 100 years or something.
Right. It does take time. I mean,
Yeah.
that makes
That's the
total
frustrating
sense.
part.
And I want to make sure I might not be quoting you correctly here, but I did want to ask. I think I understand, but I'm not sure. When you talk about finding space in the margins for conviviality, for making these better relationships in the systems that we're in, can you give me a for instance of that?
Yeah. So, one thing on the theory first, and then I'll give you an example. So, I'm getting this partly from Illich, partly also too from Michel de Certeau, who's a French philosopher. I think it's helpful to understand Certeau as kind of a conversation partner with someone like Foucault, whereas Foucault analyzes the systems of oppression, the systems of power, and sees them as very totalizing. Certeau's like, yeah, but people find ways to subvert them. And he gives a lot of great examples. Maybe one vivid one is like Charlie Chaplin in modern times, who is inhabiting this machine world, but subverting it. His body keeps getting in the way, and he keeps making the machines not operate as they're supposed to. And it's funny in the film. But I think Chaplin is like sort of image of the human freedom that remains even in the most dehumanizing systems. Certeau's mantra is we need to find ways to make do where we are in healthy ways. So, in the book, I talk about several different ones. Like I'll give one. Thoreau is inhabiting this world, new telegraph, new amounts of information bombarding him. And he doesn't go off in the wilderness, but he lives for a couple of years outside of town, like a mile and a half from town. He walks to town every day. It's like he's trying to get in the way. He's just trying to get a little bit of space. And even after he moves back to Concord, he still takes these long walks almost every day. And for him, walking, I think, is a key practice to like slow down and digest and not get caught up in the news of the day. And what I find so remarkable about someone like Thoreau is that as he decreases the quantity of his informational intake, he increases or improves the quality of his commentary on it. His essay on civilist obedience, I think, really lays the groundwork for the kinds of resistance movement that Gandhi or MLK developed later on. And they both cite him as a inspiration. And his essay on John Brown transforms sentiment about John Brown, and I think sets up Lincoln's election. So like Thoreau is deeply engaged in contemporary events, but he has something to say because he has cultivated slower habits of thought. I mean, he says in his essay, Walking, you must walk like a camel, which is said to be the only beast which ruminates while walking. Like he wants to walk in a digestive, slow manner. And he says he walks 4 hours a day. I mean, he just thinks like that's a practice that fundamentally changes the way he inhabits the media ecosystem of his day. So it's not like he opts out, but he inhabits it in a different posture because of this practice that he cultivates. So that's what I'm interested in. How can we be in the world but not of it? How can we use the tools that we have been given, whether we would have chosen them or not, but shape ourselves into the kinds of people who use them in ways that were not immediately imaginable, or in ways that, Twitter, I think if you go to Twitter, it says, the prompt is like, what's happening? It wants you to just sort of be reactive and feed it whatever's happening. But what if, we practice the kind of meditative walking that Thoreau enjoins and think in a different wavelength, and then act or communicate out of those habits. That's what I'm interested in.
Haiku only for Twitter.
Yeah. If we all had to, form our thoughts into these limits, these forms, that would limit what you would say. Absolutely.
Forgive me, it's a little bit further back, but as you were talking, I couldn't help but think about tools not being neutral.
Yeah.
I have never owned a truck, but I have several friends who have trucks and have complained that when you have a truck, people notice, right? And they get asked. People do not ask me for my car or for my minivan to come help with the projects. But if you have a truck, even if you choose not to, you still get asked, right? Yeah. And I think that's similar with you can make all sorts of choices with the truck, but by virtue of having a truck, you have a different set of choices to make.
Yes.
Kind of similar with if you engage with Twitter or X or whatever it's called now. You have a different set of options than if you go to Facebook, YouTube.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is we're seeing a lot of that even collapse because of the rise of TikTok. Like when I talk to my day job is as a digital marketer. When I talk to people about TikTok, they're like, "Oh, that's a young people's thing. I like Reels," and I'm like, "Well, it's just like Reels." And I don't think they realize it's literally just Reels. Of course, the algorithms and all that behind that are different, and that's something. There is kind of a black box effect to that. Yeah. That's a different discussion. But forgive me, that was just something that popped to mind. The truck example.
That's a great example because I think it's a concrete example of the kind of upstream decision that oftentimes has to be made. If you choose not to have an internet-enabled phone, right? Then there's all kinds of choices, downstream choices that you don't have to deliberate about, right? So if you choose, to put these limits on your engagement or to only engage in these ways, then you don't have to work through the kind of tricky prudential choices later on. And I think, I'm not sure there's one prescribed set of upstream choices to make, but I do think we should be more like the Amish in thinking as families or sort of institutional level, community level, what are some upstream choices we want to make to just relieve us from these burdens downstream of always being asked, can I borrow your truck? Should I post this? Should I weigh in? I can post to all my followers about what I think about the election. Should I do so? And if you can't, or if you put limits on yourself that's not an option, then you don't have to think about it, And I think we often see our adoption of tools as inevitable, right? We have to do whatever is accessible to us. And we need more people who will remind us that this is not a foregone conclusion. My friend Brad East likes to call Wendell Berry the prophet of the inevitable. Someone who tells us it could be otherwise. And we need prophets of the inevitable to say, you don't have to use these tools in that way. You don't have to use all the tools. You can choose from among the tools. We can kind of cobble together the assortment that makes sense for our context and our obligations and vocations. Your example of truck is a great example because, people who own a tool like that all of a sudden think, wow, am I obligated to use it? Because I could use it for good, for all these good things, but it really reshapes your life.
On a little bit more on the social media side of things, I remember seeing an article and it just really struck me how odd this was during, the Palestinian situation has continued to escalate. But when that first started, I remember seeing an article that said, this list of celebrities have not given an opinion on, on the Palestinian. I was like, why? And just the idea that everyone has to, and that's baked into the medium there. It's like, if you can give it, you should give it because we can just give out all this kind of information. And then the people who were giving their opinions, I was like, why is their opinion better than mine? I mean,
Right.
what is this? It's such an odd thing that everything's become a poll, and it's like, if you
And if you opt out,
Yeah.
you're somehow morally culpable.
Yes, you're morally culpable, and it's like, what is their expertise in this, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's this kind of loss of expertise, and uh, I think if you get down to really absurd examples, people see it, right? It's
Yep.
like if you take 20 people and have them look at a car, and 19 people say you should do one thing, and one person says to do something else, and the one person's a mechanic,
You should follow that person.
like probably follow the mechanic, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's a great point. I mean, that's just one example of how we inhabit this system, and we so rarely think, why have I adopted the expectations of the medium, right?
Yes.
And how could we inhabit the system with a different set of expectations? Like, I could remain silent and try to learn and not be an expert on everything.
Which of course is I goes back to, I love that you've been using that term totalizing, right? It's like, I have to know everything about everything, which is a ridiculous goal when said out loud, but we feel that pressure.
Yes. Yeah. And I think these metaphors help us to recognize the ridiculousness of some of the expectations that are put upon us. Because so often it's unarticulated, and it's just the sort of assumptions that we catch from the tools that we're given, that we're asked to use.
There's a couple other metaphors. I actually think you have quite a few throughout your book, but another one you have is conversation. Can you talk a little bit so you talked about walking and how we
Yep.
can think about slowing down and ruminating. Of course, that's
Yep.
a great, immediately makes us just think of meditation in general, or
Yeah.
rumination.
Yep.
But how does conversation help us to think better about technology?
Yeah. So, sometimes we can be nostalgic about the book. And I think Postman falls into this sometimes, like, oh, if we just get back to the book, that'd be great. But I think the book has some baked in problems too. The book can be kind of one way, and it can privilege sort of long form, sustained thinking to the detriment of back and forth conversation. Something like you get in a Platonic dialogue, which is clearly coming out of an oral culture. So one of the authors I look at is Margaret Fuller, and I think she's an editor for one thing. So she sees her job as editing, as kind of staging a conversation where maybe she doesn't have to be the central voice, but she can shape other voices and put them together, and maybe try to come up with a conversation that is more than the sum of its parts. She also holds these sort of like conversations, they kind of like a European salon or something, where she'll, or kind of like maybe a idealized college classroom where there's like a question. Maybe she'll bring in some readings, but she'll try to help people think substantively about fundamental issues. And there's an art to that, right? Like, if you just kind of go in guns ablazing and say, this is the point, boom, maybe people will agree with you, but they won't have engaged in the process of thought. And she wants to her kind of question asking and kind of dosages of new ideas. She's trying to incite participants into thinking for themselves. Again, I mean, she's thinking about this as explicitly following on the form of a Socratic dialogue, right? Where Socrates' point is to get his interlocutors to think. And if he just told them the answers, that would be counterproductive. So, sometimes we want the TED Talk to tell us the answer, give me the takeaways, have ChatGPT read this long thing and give me the content. And Margaret Fuller would be like, no, you're missing the whole point. The whole point is you yourself participating in the process of the back and forth of dialogue toward truth. And even in her books, I look in particular at one of her books, Somewhere on the Lakes, 1843. Even in her books, she violates all of your readerly expectations, and she doesn't just give you the point or kind of a straight narrative. She puts voices, often contrasting voices, in dialogue, which made the book have very poor reviews. People didn't like it because it didn't meet their expectations. So maybe it's not a good sales technique. But I think, her goal is, again, to form readers who could, in that case, who could participate in a pluralistic, multi-ethnic, confusing democracy in the West, or the Midwest at the time. In America, we have all these different ethnicities and religions and people with different priorities coming together. Like, how are you going to live well together? Well, you're going to have to learn to be good conversationalists. And so she writes a book to try to produce the kinds of readers she thinks the country needs. So, I'm not sure exactly what the analog to those forms are today. Analogs, I think one of the things I actually talk about briefly is the possibility that podcasts could sort of fill in that role. Maybe 2 or 3 people having a conversation might model the arts of conversation for listeners, even though they themselves can't chime in immediately directly. So yeah, and I think, social media maybe, but it has other problems. It's often not like a sustained conversation. It's often more chaotic and noisy with spectators clamoring, not a lot of truth seeking sometimes. But I think Fuller is helpful in helping us imagine maybe the goal should not be somehow returning to the book, but in finding forms in our current technological environment, finding forms that could make space for sustained, leisurely, thoughtful, back and forth dialogue.
Well, of course, I resonate with that. I mean,
Yeah. That's why you're doing this.
Yes, exactly. So I appreciate that. I've always found myself more drawn probably to books than even talking to people. And so it's also a good reminder that there's weaknesses to books,
Yeah.
right? One thing I've often found myself doing, and my friends would laugh at me, I'll read a book and I'll take away whatever I think is useful or valuable, and I'll forget about all the rest. And so I'll be like, didn't this author make this great point? And they're like, I think you're kind of misread that. And you're just like, well, I'm like, yeah, I just disagreed with that. I just took what I thought, it's like, it's so easy to do that because the author's not there.
Right. It's in your hands. That's absolutely right. You can be and there's good and bad, right? I mean, on the one hand, you can glean wisdom from a lot of sources. On the other hand, maybe you need to sit with, that disagreement more. And hence why it's important to read books and then talk about them with people. You can do both, get the best of both.
And it's easy to dismiss something you read in a book in a way that you can't dismiss a person to your face. Like, you're just like, well, that's just stupid. And you just keep reading. Unfortunately, I mean, face-to-face conversation, I think people realize generally you don't do that. But
sometimes.
Sometimes. But in social media, I've had those conversations here on the podcast where, that lack of presence can make it much easier. We definitely see that more in especially comment sections.
Yes.
People were very confident to say, well, that's just stupid. And it I know how long I spend reading comment sections, and it's not like I'm giving it really sustained thought. I mean, I have, but that's pretty rare. Most of the time, that's a very flippant response.
Yes, exactly. That's not the kind of deep conversation you're looking for.
That's not it. That's not the metaphor you're looking for. The YouTube comment section.
No, I mean, I think it's Zana Tefuki, who's a Turkish writer writing about the Arab Spring protests, and she says, one of the problems with the social media in that context is it galvanizes support, right? But then it can't actually build the community. She says when we engage with these voices on social media, it's not like we're talking to other people. Her metaphor is it's like we're sitting in a sporting stadium cheering with our fans, and we see and hear the fans of the opposing team.
Yes.
But we're like with our fans. So we're taunting each other, and it's like, we're developing group belonging and group opposition, even as we're hearing other views. It's not conducive to like learning and changing our minds or anything.
Something I've seen with my own channel is, especially with these kinds of hour-long conversations, I'll get some very thoughtful, very long responses on the interviews themselves. But when we put up the shorts, the responses I get are very different.
Yes. Yes. I mean, and this is like the technocratic thing. Twitter has experimented. I'm not sure they still do this, where you can't retweet or comment on something that has a link unless you first read the article or click the article, right? They're trying to get people to slow down and read the whole thing. But I just don't think that doesn't really work. People don't, or that's not going to change behavior. Yeah.
So some of the other metaphors, and if you don't mind, just love to keep walking through these. You also have cross-bearing, and that one's really fascinating to me. How does bearing one's cross help us think better about technology?
Yeah, so this is the kind of culmination of the book. And I get this from Melville's poem Clarel, which nobody reads. It's an 18,000 line poem, super long. He self-publishes it.
How do you spell that? Forgive me.
Clarel, Clarel.
Thank you.
It's the name of the title character that sort of which is sort of loosely autobiographical. But Melville publishes Confidence Man on April Fool's Day, I think in 1857, I think. And then shortly thereafter, he goes on this pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And then decades later, he reworks his journals and his notebooks into this massive poem. And what happens is the character Clarel goes to the Holy Land basically having lost his faith. He no longer believes, but he thinks, well, maybe if I go back to like where Jesus walked, I will have some epiphany, some recovery of faith. And pretty much every significant scientific, religious, philosophical, cultural debate in the 19th century gets played out over the course of this poem. Like, it's him and a group of sort of a shifting cast of fellow pilgrims kind of making this circuit in Israel now, the Levant, and their conversation. And one of the characters has tattooed on his arm this symbol of the sort of five. It's like sort of five crosses, kind of representing the five wounds of Christ. There's also allusions to the three magi, like going to Bethlehem after the sign of the stars. And that's the image that Melville imprints on the cover of the book. So I think a little bit about like, what does it mean to sort of own and carry one's sufferings and to walk toward this hoped for truth that we might not be able to totally glimpse. And what I think is remarkable about Clarel is all of his questions about religion, about God, are not really answered. Like there's no propositional answer. But at the end of the poem, there's this remarkably affirmative epilogue where the poet sort of tells Clarel, even Stoics may be astounded into heaven. You might receive an epiphany that you did not expect. And I go back to Moby Dick, Melville's earlier novel, to give one example of this. So a couple of sort of threads, I'm condensing a lot, but a couple of threads from Moby Dick that I think indicate what Melville's thinking about here. One is when near the end of the book, Queequeg, this sort of pagan harpooner, he thought he was going to die, so they made a coffin for him, and then he got better, and so his coffin becomes commandeered to be the life buoy. And as the carpenter is refitting this coffin to be the life buoy, Captain Ahab comes up to the carpenter and is like kind of mocking him. And it's like, what are you doing that this sign of death has been remade into a symbol of life? Like that seems crazy. You have no respect for meaning. But that is precisely what Christians think the cross is, right? This sign of death remade into a symbol of life. And the very ambiguity or ambivalence of signifiers, which so often is a source of frustration, right? In our communication with one another, we misunderstand each other, we argue about things. So oftentimes ambiguity is a source of frustration. At that moment for Ahab, or at least for the carpenter or for Melville, I think that kind of ambiguity becomes the possibility of redemption, that things which are signs of death could become the sign of life. And then dramatically at the end of the book, it is that coffin turned to life buoy that saves Ishmael's life. So he is not saved because of anything he does. He's saved. Even a Stoic may be astounded into heaven. He is saved sort of you catastrophically, unexpectedly, and he's saved by this symbol of grim death that has been transformed into a symbol of life. So what I try to do that chapter is say, like, I think there are ways that we can sort of bear mystery and the finitude of human understanding humbly and hopefully. Like, we can seek meaning together, and perhaps meaning will be given to us in ways that we don't expect or foresee or anticipate. I mean, that's the sign, that's the way that Melville understands the cross. It's this, the possibility that death and ambiguity and failure could be transformed into hope.
Perhaps I'm seeing this a little too literally. So let me just clarify this. When you're talking about, of course, there's a metaphorical and there's a metaphysical, like in Orthodox Christianity understanding of that. But for your book, are you talking about viewing technology that seen at the outset is seen as death, but if we change our perception on it, it could become a means of life? Am I reading that correctly, or am I reading that too literally?
I guess the way I try to frame it is not so much the technology itself, but the conversations that we have on it, maybe.
Okay.
The possibility that our search for meaning might seem thwarted by technology, right? So often the technologies we have, they can seem to only foster misunderstandings, right? I think the recent election is a good example of this, right? People, I can't believe that, you don't think this president is the obvious choice. How could you possibly think otherwise? People are very sure about what they think and can't even imagine alternatives. So sometimes we can get very frustrated by this failure of communication. And I think Melville looks at the cross as, both a literal sort of theological, metaphysical statement of this, but also maybe a metaphorical statement of the possibility of understanding beyond all expectation. So I haven't thought about whether it's the technology itself. That's not how I thought about it, but maybe that too. I wouldn't want to exclude that.
Yeah, I understand that, but if I understand you correctly, then you're talking more about us. When you're bearing a cross, there's pain and there's suffering, and so what you're talking about is continuing to pursue meaning even in the face of that.
Exactly.
Understood.
That we take up. It's not easy to try to understand other people and try to communicate across disagreement. But if we endure, Melville suggests, maybe we'll be rewarded with understanding and conviviality in places and that we would not have expected. Yeah.
I don't think I had anticipated perseverance as like one of the main virtues of your book, but that makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah, I mean, walking, conversation, cross-bearing. The other hopeful metaphor I have is friendship, which I think is also tied up with persevering through the inevitable ways that people will disappoint us.
And it takes a long time. If you're like, oh, we've been friends 6 months, you're like, okay. Sure, but it's very different from we've been friends continuously for 20 years. That's
yes. There's no shortcuts.
Dr. Bilbro, it has been wonderful having you on. I would want to be respectful of your time. Besides buying and reading your excellent book, what is something you would recommend the audience think about or do this week after having listened to this episode?
Well, I think as we talked about, maybe listening to an episode is itself a way of practicing this sort of capacity to go back and forth and to engage in a conversation. You could go for a long walk. You could, sort of think, where are the places in my life where I experience conviviality, glimpses of healthy life with other people and relationships, and how can I, cultivate those and maybe let those shape or crowd out the sources, the places in my life where I experience frustration and kind of being at loggerheads with other people. But I hope, that the fruit of this book and of this conversation is maybe a more sober assessment of our immediate ecology, but one that has plenty of room for hope. There are opportunities for us to do good work, even in an imperfect system, because all systems are imperfect. But we still have the capacity to try to seek truth, seek understanding, and seek friendship with other people.
Dr. Bilbro, it's been a joy talking to you today. Thank you.
Thank you.